Please welcome Yann Martel and Sandip Roy. Over to you, Sandip.
Hi, everybody. Before we start, we need a little favor. Yann needs to send a picture to his kids to make sure they know that he's actually here working. So I need you all to wave your hands, and I'll take a picture of Yann with you guys in the background, okay?
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. On count of three, we are going to do a hi. Every one of us will have their hands raised up and waving, okay? So we will do it twice, one for us and one for him. All right. Yes, please. Thank you.
You just tell me when to go. Three, two, one. Did you guys wave? Okay, good. One more. So on three, two, one, you can say Richard Parker, okay? Three, two, one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for indulging us. Yann Martel, welcome to Kolkata. Welcome to the Kolkata Literary Meet. I understand that you first came to India in 1996 as a backpacker. Why India? Why did you decide to come to India at that time?
At that time, I was following a girl. I, in fact, wasn't coming to India. I was just following this girl who had been traveling through Indonesia, and then she was going to travel through India, and she said, "Why don't you join me?" And she was beautiful. So I followed her. I came here for her, and it didn't work out with her, but it worked out with India. So I didn't fall in love with the girl, but I fell in love with the country. So I backpacked through India for about 6 months, that time the north. And I found it so compelling that I came back 3 years later, 4 years later. And it's that second time that I started working on Life of Pi.
But before that, I read you were working on a book that you then abandoned, which has...
Well, that was the second time. Yeah, the second time I came to India, I decided to settle here for a number of months and work on a book set in Portugal, which in fact had nothing at all to do with India. I just thought, this place is so...
You wanted the peace and quiet.
That's right. This is such an intoxicatingly vivid place. There's so much intellectual ferment, artistic activity here, that I figured it'd be a good place to settle, just to stimulate my imagination. But the Portuguese novel just didn't come alive. As I say in the author's note of Life of Pi, I was really working on a Portuguese novel and it didn't come to life, so I put it aside. And so therefore suddenly I had to be where I was, which was here. So I opened my eyes and I noticed things that I hadn't particularly noticed before, i.e. manifestations of religion and animals. And it's noticing those two aspects of India that brought Life of Pi to me.
I want to get into that, but before we leave that abandoned novel, is this true? I read somewhere that you took all your notes from that and you shipped it to a fictitious address in Siberia or somewhere with an equally fictitious return address?
That's in the author's note. No, I actually just mailed it back to Montreal where I lived. I think writers are always...
Want to make up a little extra.
Are recyclers. We're great recyclers. So you don't throw away a good idea. You just hope that you'll use it later. And in fact, that Portuguese novel, I finally did come to write it. It's my latest novel, The High Mountains of Portugal. It took me 15 years to finally understand what I was trying to do and how to do it.
Well, you talked about India and animals, so let's get to the animals part of it. People have obviously seen the animals that appear over and over again in different parts in your different books, whether, of course, most famously Richard Parker and the other animals in Life of Pi. Then there was a donkey named Beatrice and Virgil, who are taxidermist animals, but animals nonetheless, in Beatrice and Virgil. And in your newest book, The High Mountains of Portugal, there's a chimpanzee, or maybe 3 chimpanzees, and a bear cub too, that come. So, you know, Levi Strauss had that famous quote that is often paraphrased as, animals are good to think with. Is that something you would agree?
Absolutely. I think it's very curious in Canada, and I'd say generally in the West, there's a disappearance of animals once we reach adulthood. We literally separate ourselves from animals. So you have animals in children's books, but it's very rare to have in adult literature animals play a significant role. And in the same way, in the West, we don't live in proximity to animals. You know, most people in a city in Canada would know where their hospitals are, where their universities are, but most people wouldn't have a clue where their slaughterhouses are. We hide what we do to animals. We hide, we shy away from them. And so in a temperate country like Canada, it's quite common that people live with no relationship with animals whatsoever, especially if they don't have a pet. And in winter, there'll be millions of Canadians who literally never see an animal for weeks on end, nothing at all. And I think that kind of species isolation is not good for us, because our strongest point as animals is to relate. And if you only relate with yourselves, that becomes a bit claustrophobic. So I think there's a loss of relationship that makes us lose our way a bit. And so what struck me about India is simply that there is still that relationship with animal, which of course is typical of all tropical countries. You just happen to have more animals present because you live in a more hotter climate. But what I found striking in India is the presence of animals not only literally in the streets of India, but also in its mythology. There's a lot more animals in Hinduism than there is in Christianity, for example. Even in Christianity, if you go from Judaism to Christianity, what's striking is the disappearance of animals. The Old Testament is full of animals, real and mythical. The New Testament has hardly any. Has a donkey, which is a symbol of modesty, on which Jesus rides when he gets to Jerusalem. And there's a rooster to signal to Peter that he's betrayed the Lord. Those are pretty well the only significant animals. Compare that with Hinduism, where there's, Ganesh, Hanuman, every god has an animal transporter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge presence of animals. And so I was just struck at the proximity, the unsuspected, for me, proximity of the divine and the animal, how there's definitely a link to them.
So what do you think that proximity does to people who are part of those faiths, about their view on whatever the separation between humanity or animality is?
Well, I think it just broadens your perspective. It puts you on a planet in relationship with other beings on this planet and relativizes your position. I think what happens when you separate yourself completely from animals is an excess of reason. Animals can't reason the way we can, and yet they still adapt and live on this planet quite well. In fact, in some ways, much better than us. We are destroying this planet. Animals are not. Animals left to themselves reach a kind of equilibrium between predator and prey. We are quite quickly destroying our own planet. So I think relationship with animals, and it's not a question of, loving them or particularly relating with them. It's simply a question of being aware of them. And I think that awareness relativizes our power and our capacities and puts them into perspective.
What I find very interesting in the way you portray animals in the book, including the latest book with the chimpanzees in it, is that you resist making them, often when animals come up in books, they are slowly sort of humanized, But the animals in your book are still unknowable till the end. And even when this character in the newest book is literally living with the chimpanzee and they're grooming each other but at the same time, he's acutely aware of the fact that if something suddenly happens and the chimpanzee turns on him, he'll be dead and he'll have no idea what triggered it. So, I mean, but that's a conscious decision for you to keep that.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you start anthropomorphizing animals, you're just turning them into a mirror of yourself, and that's interesting if you're interested in looking at yourself. But if you're interested in looking at the animal in and of itself, then you should not anthropomorphize them. So, no, I'm not interested in that. What I like about animals is precisely that they're alive and yet mysterious to us. You know, the fascinating thing, if you go to a zoo, the most interesting animal to look at are the primates, the higher primates. If you look in the eyes of a gorilla and a chimpanzee, I always find it vaguely troubling, because you get the sense that there's a glimmer of a very rough-hewn intelligence, but coming from a radically different alien species. And I find that very troubling. So I don't see any point in seeing something that's alien and falsely making it familiar.
I don't know if you've been to the zoo here in Kolkata, have you?
It's right next to my hotel.
It's right now. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. You can go, but zoos here often feel really sad. And something I feel when you're talking about that proximity to animals, I feel, though, that when I go to a zoo in the West, perhaps because of the distance, people are also, for the most part, relatively well-behaved around the animals, where here, perhaps because of the proximity, people are constantly goading the animals, teasing them, throwing pellets at them, trying to make them pose for selfies with them. And maybe it's also a sign that we treat the animals as so close to us, and we're teasing them like we would tease other neighborhood kids.
That's an interesting point you bring up. It's interesting. If you look at the history of zoos in the West, especially the zoos in Britain, in the 19th century, there would be appalling things committed to animals in zoos. And people who studied this realized that what was happening was, because at the time in Britain it was still very much a class-driven system, a man would go to the zoo and say, "My master beats me, and so therefore you, animal, I will beat you. I will mistreat you the way I have been mistreated." And those kinds of abuses started falling away in England with the rise of a sort of egalitarianism, of greater opportunity for the working class. Once the class system started disappearing to some extent in England, there started to be fewer acts of atrocities perpetrated on animals. So it was a sort of a working out of class frustrations and seeing animals as somehow lower on the scale and therefore acceptable to abuse them. So why that might happen in India might perhaps be the same way, of I feel mistreated, therefore I will mistreat you because you are lower than me.
That's very absolutely plausible, I think. In Life of Pi, you wrote about, the animal will be sort of divine, and the lifeboat crossing the Pacific will be an odyssey of the soul. And in the high hills of Portugal, it becomes literally closer, the divinity, the animal's divinity. It's a three sort of linked stories. And in the first one, there's a man who's looking for a crucifix where the Christ face has been carved by a disillusioned priest in a Portuguese colony, and the face is that of a chimpanzee. Tell us where that idea, came from. I mean, it's often silly to ask people, where do ideas come from? They just come. But also, were you at all nervous that it would be considered blasphemous to have a chimpanzee figure on a cross?
Not particularly, because Christianity has been sort of so mocked for so long now that they're quite used to it. But the idea came to me, in fact, from a church near Paris, where there was a very old crucifix, and the Christ was done in a very awkward fashion. And I looked at it and I said, he looks like a chimpanzee. The perspectives are all wrong. It was obviously the artist thought that he'd put the crucifix high up, and therefore the legs should be short and the arms should be longer. And then the face was too long. It looked very much like that of a chimpanzee. And that was years and years and years ago. But it just stayed in my mind, this idea of a crucified chimpanzee and what it might mean to us. And finally I came to the realization that just as what we're doing to our planet is, in a sense, crucifying animals. We're abusing them. And the idea that what I liked about chimpanzees is they're our closest genetic partners in nature. They have the highest degree of genetic material that is common to us, 98.7%, I think. Now, that 1.3%, of course, is a key difference, but nonetheless, a huge amount of the genetic of their genetic makeup with us. So there's sort of a proximity to us yet a distance, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And just as in Christian mythology, Christ shares a lot of our genetic makeup, but not all of it. He's 98.7% human, let's say, and 1.3% divine, and that makes a key difference. In the same way, chimpanzees are slightly different from us, but on that same scale. So I just like what that might mean if we had that up there. What might it mean to us? But I also was looking at, as Sandip was saying, there's two other parts in the novel. There are two other forms of the chimpanzee. In that first part, I was looking at the idea of an ideology that has died, that has basically become a piece of wood on a wall, that has lost its vitality. Because in the third part of the novel, there is a literal live chimpanzee, and the person very much lives in relationship with it. Whereas in the first part, you have an absence of relationship and an idea that has become reified, to use that fancy academic word.
And in this middle part, is this person who is conducting a rather surreal autopsy on an old man who has died, and he literally finds inside him a chimpanzee and a bear cub, and they represent different things that chimpanzees do. But what I was struck was that in all three parts, the men who are having this transformative experience are all bereaved. They are all coming from terrible loss. They've lost their spouse or child or spouse and child. So why was it important for them to kind of come to almost the edge of their existence in order to relate anew?
Well, in some ways, the same way with Life of Pi. Life of Pi starts with a tragedy, with the sinking of the ship and the loss of a family. To me, art is about exploring things when they don't work out. I don't think anyone becomes an artist if they're entirely happy. If you're entirely happy, there's no reason to be an artist because you're not going to make any money, and it's a lot of work. I think you start being an artist when you feel slightly out of sync with the world. And I find often stories start when something goes wrong. That's when you start having a story. So there's a story in Life of Pi because a ship sinks. And in the high mountains of Portugal, my premise was to posit, what do three people do when tragedy strikes them? In each one of them, someone has lost someone. In part one, the character has lost his lover and their child. In part two, the pathologist has lost his wife. And in part three, the senator, a Canadian senator, has lost his wife. So I start from a premise of, I am suffering, what do I do? Where do I go with suffering? And to me, that remains a fascinating question. I know what to do with happiness. I just live it. What do I do with suffering? What do we all do with suffering? That question has always interested me.
You said, art comes out in feeling out of sorts, feeling out of place. Was that something you struggled with from the beginning?
Yes, I went to university, and by the time I was in second year at university, I thought to myself, what am I doing here? I was studying philosophy, which in some ways I loved, but at 19, I didn't necessarily want Kierkegaard whispering in my ear. I just felt, what am I doing here? And as a result of that, I wrote a really bad play. And it was a terrible play, but I suddenly realized that I loved playing with language, and maybe this could be something that I could do. And so I started writing these plays, these very bad plays, and then these very bad short stories, and then a very bad novel, as a reaction to try to, this is maybe something that I could do. And it finally brought me immense satisfaction. Even if it was very bad stuff that I was writing, I loved writing. I loved playing with languages, with characters, with settings, and through plot, trying to make some sort of commentary on life.
So these three parts that we were talking about in the newest book, as you sort of explained a little bit, it is about that loss of faith in a way, and then there is a kind of belief, agnosticism in the second part, and then in the third part, you're actually living with what you call the faith object. Could you talk a little bit about that structure that you decided to choose?
Yeah, I have to explain, first of all, that I'm not at all a particularly religious person. I'm a completely secular person. who's come to be interested in religious thinking. Not particularly in organized religion, but religious thinking. Because I find religious thinking is a kind of magical thinking that's very close to artistic thinking. You know, novels and religions work in the same way. They both operate on a suspension of disbelief. If you start a novel and it's not credible to you, if it's full of mistakes and you can't believe it, you don't buy into it. You give up on reading it because it's not credible. Same way with a religion. The first step in a religion working for anyone is they must suspend their disbelief and have faith. And once they have faith, they take it all in. So both operate on a suspension of disbelief. And both, in some ways, in many ways, use the same language. I've always been struck at how art and religion have gone hand in hand since the beginning of time. Religion uses art to express itself. Think of all the beautiful paintings that art uses to... And the way religion tells its stories uses all the tools of fiction. Metaphor, allegory, symbolism, parables. Religion uses art. And there is something vaguely religious about art. When you see a great painting, what does it do to us? It transforms us. It elevates us. It makes us see things differently. There is something about art and religion that go well together, and I think I just call them a form of magical thinking, a way that it changes reality. Religions and art are both transformative experiences. They change who you are and how you look at life, in a way that I would argue science does not do. Science has immeasurably improved our lives. In no way am I against science and rationality. I love vaccination and computers and airplanes and phones. They change how we live, but I don't think they change who we are, whereas art and religion do. And so as a secular writer, I'm just interested in the grand statements, the transformative claims of religion. And so in the high mountains of Portugal, I was interested in looking at how we live in three states of belief, one having none, one having some, and in the middle, aspiring to presence, but being tested, not seeing it. So in part one, I look at absence. In part three, presence. So in part three, I have this man who is living with a chimpanzee. And in a quite very obvious way, the chimpanzee is a symbol of Christ. And I chose Christianity simply because it's a religion I happen to know better than any other religion, and it lends itself very well to... Hinduism too with Krishna lends itself well to sort of on a very human scale, in a way that Islam doesn't, for example. You can't really have a metaphor for Allah as a fellow human being. It doesn't work as well as, let's say, Krishna might or Christ does. So anyway, the chimpanzee is a symbol of Christ. So I was positing, in writing The High Mountains of Portugal, three different kinds of relationships with a divine figure. And I thought to myself, what would be the most intimate relationship that people might have had with Christ? And it struck me, well, obviously people who actually met him. Very few people deny that Christ existed. They all deny what he meant, his claims, but very few people deny the historical existence of a Jewish rabbi, let's say, named Jesus. And so some people actually met him. And he obviously was an extraordinarily charismatic figure. There are a whole bunch of other Jews who claim to be messiahs, by the way, but they were all killed off by the Romans. What's unique about Jesus is 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him. All the other Jewish messiahs were promptly killed off by the Roman authorities, and we've completely forgotten about them unless you're a student of the history of Palestine in the year 2000, in the year zero. There's something obviously extraordinarily charismatic about Jesus of Nazareth that stayed with people, and they kept on talking about him and talking about him and talking about him until he transformed the history of the West and of the world. So who would have had the most intense encounter would have been the few hundred people who would have actually have met him. Obviously his disciples, but obviously people that he would have met walking around the streets. Some would have actually maybe spoken to him. Some might have actually just seen him. But that would have been the most intense one. So that in part three of my novel is represented by the senator actually living with this chimpanzee. And anyone who lives intensely with an animal is changed by that relationship. And then in part one, I have someone who lives in complete absence. And as I said, Jesus is just a piece of wood on a cross. And in the middle, we have someone who aspires to that presence but is bedeviled by absence. And that's the pathologist. And that was the one that I was the most interesting, is what do you do when you believe and you are tested? when you have no proof but you still want to believe. That's the one that I find, that's the one that we most of all believe in. That's our condition for most of us. And not only in religious terms, but in every term. We all have some kind of faith, and inevitably our faith will be tested. Whether it's in a loved one, in a political system, in a in a sports team, our faiths will be tested. And I'm interested in what we do then.
Yeah, because you say that the great challenge of modern times is this tussle between balancing faith and reason.
Absolutely. Especially in our current times, in the current economic system we have, which tends to pacify us. The modern international capitalist system wants you as a consumer, not as a thinker. It doesn't want you to be too active. You know, various forms of authoritarian democracy, like we're experiencing in the United States, perhaps to a certain extent in India, certainly in Russia, does not want you to be active citizens, wants you to be passive citizens. We're pushed more and more to be passive. And that's not good for us. We have to be active. And that's the only way that faith becomes... Faith is never a passive thing. Any kind of faith, religious, romantic, political, faith demands to be in a level of activity, of engagement with reality. And that demands a real effort. And you do need to have reason to make your faith fruitful, but you have to hold on to that faith object. And that's a challenge.
Speaking of challenging at the same time, you know, when Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister in Canada, you decided at one point you were going to send him a book every 2 weeks. How many books did you end up sending?
102.
102 books. And how did you choose what books you wanted to send him?
Well, to explain the background of this, Stephen Harper was one of those small-minded conservatives who, as I was saying, see citizens as customers. Not as citizens, which is a wonderful term, citizen, but just as consumers, as part of an economic machine. He reduced us to our economic usefulness rather than as seeing us as full human beings. And he was typical of a certain breed of men. And unfortunately, it's usually men who are like this, less so women. But there's a kind of men who read when they're young, and just around the ages of maybe 22 to 24, their mind starts to shut down. They become who they are for the rest of their lives. And at that point, they stop reading. Until then, they may have read novels and poetry and plays, but around 22 to 24, they stop reading, they get real, and if they read at all, they only read nonfiction, because that's real, whereas fiction is fluffy nonsense. And they don't read for about 40 years, and then when they're pushed out of their corporations, and they're 65, 70, and they have nothing to do, then they may start reading again, and they discover the wonders of books. And that's fine. It's not for me to judge how people should live. But unfortunately, certainly in Canada and elsewhere in the world, it's precisely those middle-aged white men who rule us. And if you have a middle-aged white man who does not read, I don't know how he can be wise. You know, in India, there's a lot of people who don't read, but you have this wonderful system, which of course is, I'm sure, much abused, but the system of the guru, the system where the teacher is central, is a wonderful way of looking at life. We all need teachers. But in the West, unless you happen to have literally wonderful teachers at school and at university, unless you have to have wonderful parents or encountering wonderful people, there's only so many gurus that go around. The only other way to get wisdom, as far as I know, is either to read books or to travel. To me, traveling is a form of reading. You read the world like you read a book, or you literally read books. And if you do not read and do not travel, like George Bush didn't, like Donald Trump doesn't, like Stephen Harper doesn't, what happens is you have terrible leadership. Because the only way you can understand the other is through books. So, so the books that I chose to send Stephen Harper were, first of all, short books. Because usually people who claim not to read, who don't read, claim they don't have time. And I respect that. You know, a 900-page experimental novel is a hard read. It demands real time and devotion. And fair enough, if you're Prime Minister of Canada, you don't necessarily have that time. So I sent him usually short books, unless they were exceptionally plot-driven. So I did send him a longer book, Agatha Christie. And I sent him Pearl Buck. The Good Earth is longer, but is extraordinarily compelling. So usually short books, usually books that were fairly linear in narrative, not too experimental, and then as widely varied as I could.
No Life of Pi.
No, I didn't want to be self-interested. So I sent him books as wide as I could. So novels, poetry, plays, collection of short stories. I sent him the Bhagavad Gita, so a couple religious texts from all over the world, to show him this is what the word can do. This is how words can transform you. Read these books, and you will necessarily be a slightly expanded human being. So the first book I sent him is the book I always suggest to people who don't like reading. It's a book called The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. It's only about 80 pages long. It's a story of Ivan Ilyich, who's a provincial civil servant in Russia in the 19th century. And one day he's putting up a curtain rod, and he slips and he hits himself on the side, and he gets a little bruise. And the bruise doesn't go away. And eventually it starts hurting more and more. And eventually he realizes that he's dying. Now, this may be medical nonsense. I don't know if a bruise can actually become a tumor, but that's not the point. The point is Ivan Ilyich realizes that he's going to die. And the 80 pages of The Death of Ivan Ilyich is about how he encounters, how he lives with slowly approaching death. And it's entertaining, it's funny, it's wise, it's terrifying, all in 70, 80 pages. His wife is horrifying. She only is concerned about the pension that she might get when he dies. His friends, his so-called friends, are annoyed that they're going to lose the fourth man to play cards with them. They play a game of cards where they need a fourth player. And if Ivan Ilyich dies, we lose our fourth man to play our card game. None of them care about him. There's a servant boy named Gerasim, who's the only one who says, Master, you're suffering. What can I do? And Ivan Ilyich says, you know, Gerasim, if my feet are raised, I feel better. So Gerasim says right away, well, Master, put your feet on my shoulders. And Ivan Ilyich says, no, Gerasim, you have better things to do. And Gerasim says, no, I don't actually. And so Ivan Ilyich puts his feet on Gerasim's shoulders and feels better. He's still dying, but there's this loving kindness displayed by Gerasim that I hope we'll all meet someone like him when we are dying. So it's a wonderfully wise book, compelling, easy to read. Anyone who reads it will be somewhat wiser. So I sent him all these books, one book every 2 weeks. I sent him the Bhagavad Gita, another wonderful, wise, short book, in the hopes of improving him.
And did he ever respond?
Zilch. Nothing. 4 years. I'd send him a book and a letter explaining, talking about the book or something to do with the book. But I'll give you another example of a book I sent him. There's a wonderful short novel by Toni Morrison, the American writer. It's a book called The Bluest Eye. And The Bluest Eye is a story of a 12-year-old African-American girl from a completely dysfunctional family. So that's pretty well as far removed from Stephen Harper's life and my life as possible. You know, Stephen Harper was an empowered white male. The main character in The Bluest Eye is a disempowered 12-year-old African-American girl. Yet, it's a very dense, powerful book. You read that book, and while you're reading that book, you are that disempowered 12-year-old black girl. You are that, and therefore you finish the book, and you've lived her life a bit. And therefore, presumably, you're more empathetic. See, that's what books do to me, is they make you humble. They open you up, they reduce you, they make you cry, they make you wonder. If you don't read that at all, you have a tight little mind. And that's what Stephen Harper has.
And continues to have.
And that's dangerous. And I'll give you a counterexample of that. One day, I live in the middle of nowhere, a town called Saskatoon. It's the middle of nowhere. One day in my letterbox in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, there was a letter that said in the top left, The White House. And I thought, this must be junk mail from a shop called The White House. But no, it was the White House in Washington. Out of the blue, I got a letter from Barack Obama, who had read Life of Pi with one of his daughters, and so liked it that he wrote me a little handwritten note, complimenting me on my book, handwritten by Barack Obama. And somehow the civil service, the CIA, found my address in Saskatoon. And I'm not even American. He had nothing to gain from this politically. And in fact, if the Republicans had found out, they would have said, why is he wasting his time writing to foreign writers when he should be, working for his own country? It was a completely gratuitous act. And you can see that here's a man who reads. And you can see it in his oratory. You can see it in his vision of life. Here's a man who's been opened up by books in a way Stephen Harper has not been.
So if you had to send books if you did the same thing for Donald Trump, what book would you start with?
Possibly once again, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, but probably a grade book.
Great book.
Donald Trump literally does not read. There's a man who, The Art of the Deal was one of Donald Trump's. Yeah, there we go, Dr. Seuss. Donald Trump allegedly wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, which is not at all written by him. It was written by a ghostwriter who, when Donald Trump was running, the man wrote an article for The New Yorker saying, this man is a toddler. He cannot read. He cannot focus at all. This is dangerous. So I said maybe a grade book, maybe Dr. Seuss. I don't know.
Since you said you sent an Agatha Christie to Stephen Harper, I have to ask you to talk a little bit about, in the second section of this book, there is a long section where there's a discussion about Agatha Christie and the Gospels and about why Agatha Christie is the modern apostle.
One of the things that's wonderful about writing fiction is you can link things that aren't necessarily linked. So I happen to really like Agatha Christie. She is one of those writers who her achievement matched exactly her ambition. They're absolutely perfect. In her best works, they're absolutely perfect as murder mysteries. And I happen to notice is an extraordinary level of similarity between how the Gospels are written, how they operate, and how an Agatha Christie murder mystery works. So, I mean, Agatha Christie wrote murder mysteries, and quite literally, the Gospels are a murder mystery, the mysteries with a capital M. In Agatha Christie, we remember who the victim is, but we never remember who the victimizer is. That's one of the extraordinary things with murder mysteries, is you read them in a very compulsive way, and you want to find out who did it, who murdered the victim, who did it. You get to the end, and it's so ingenious, you never thought of it. Then you put the book away, and 6 months later, you cannot remember who did it. You know who the victim is. So she can write one of her murder mysteries, and it was the death of Roger Ackroyd. Well, Roger Ackroyd is the victim. She can say that, but you never remember who did it. And in some ways, it's the same thing with the Gospels. We all know who the victim is. Even if you're not Christians, you all know that Jesus Christ was crucified. You know he was the victim. Who killed him? It's a question that most people say, well, they have no answer to it. And there's many other similarities in the way they operate that I just thought was really fascinating. And I think it speaks to the fact that we are fascinated by death because we're mortal creatures. We're all going to die. We're all the victims of a murder, our own murder, and we're all curious as to who's going to victimize us and the process by which we become victims. We are always interested in death. And whereas Jesus brought us close to death, brought the Christians close to death by saying death is, in fact, an illusion. There is eternal life. It's just a threshold you cross. So he brought Christians close to death by making it illusory. Agatha Christie brings readers close to death by making it an entertainment. But in both cases, she brings you close to death. And it's very rare that we are brought close to death, because we don't want to be brought close to death. We avoid going to hospitals. We avoid illness. We do not like death, but we need to be close to it. And by very different means, for different reasons, I mean, Agatha Christie for reasons of entertainment, and Jesus, for whatever reasons he did it, bring us close to death. And so there's many ways in which they echo each other, and I don't think she meant to do that, but inadvertently she reproduced many of the narrative techniques of the Gospels. So I just discussed that in the High Mountains. It just struck me as
a wonderful section, and I highly recommend you read it. I want to open it up to questions, but before that, one thing for you, Yann, is when you talk about, death, and the way we are wary of it, and we don't want to go close to it. One of the subjects you deal with in the previous book, Beatrice and Virgil, is the genocide, and you're doing it through these two animals who are facing the horrors. And you got a fair amount of flack for it, and the person who is writing this play in it is kind of aware that there might be flack, because the author's wife, I think, says, oh, this is like Winnie the Pooh meets the Holocaust. But when you got flack for it, when people said, oh, you're trivializing the Holocaust by comparing it to extermination of animals and all of that, did you realize that that the Holocaust is still resistant to metaphor or the Holocaust romance or the Holocaust Gothic novel in a way perhaps where religion is not so much anymore?
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. How do I start here? In Beatrice and Virgil, I've always been interested in the Holocaust. I'm not Jewish. my family, on both sides, my families have been in Quebec for 400 years. So I really have no relationship historically, ethnically, to the Holocaust. However, the Holocaust has always fascinated me, not only because it's horrifying, but because it doesn't fit into the rest of history. Genocide never fits. Whereas wars, I have a brother, so I know war. War is a common feature of human existence. Whether it's a squabble between siblings or an outright true war, we know about conflict. We know about limited resources and the conflicts that may ensue. We know the ways wars operate. We all understand war, which is why children still play war. When I was a child, growing up 20 years after the end of the Second World War, as a little boy, I still played war. We would play war because we could understand it imaginatively. Kids don't play genocide. It doesn't work narratively. And so growing up, I always noticed that the Holocaust didn't fit in my understanding of the past. And so I've always periodically come back to the Holocaust, seeing movies, reading books. And I finally decided that my best way to understand something is to write about it. And in therefore looking more closely at the Holocaust, I noticed that, as you just said, it is metaphor resistant. Whereas we metaphorize war all the time. We invent fictions about war very comfortably. I'll give you a very good example. There's a classic American novel called The Red Badge of Courage by a man named Stephen Crane. It's considered a classic of the American Civil War with extraordinary depictions of battle during the American Civil War. Stephen Crane wasn't even born when the Civil War took place. He was born after it. And what he did his research. He talked to veterans, went to the places where the wars took place. He used his imagination to create a fiction about the war that was so compelling that it's considered a war classic. And if you want to understand the American Civil War, you read The Red Badge of Courage. You don't find that with the Holocaust. The Holocaust has always been very suspicious of fiction. So, for example, there's I've just blanked out. Anyway, it's been very resistant. Any fiction about the Holocaust usually turns out to be thinly disguised biography or autobiography. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We need to know what happened in the past. We need to understand it factually before we can start play with it with our imagination. So, for example, whether it's the Holocaust or the partition, you need to know really what happened before you can start telling stories about it. So far, there's been a resistance to telling stories, fictions about the Holocaust. And you might say, well, why do you want to tell stories about the Holocaust? The reason I think why it's important is that we tend not to tune in to factual histories as closely as we do to stories. Stories are a good way for us to understand things. Stories simplify, get to the essence of. Good example is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Animal Farm very neatly encapsulates what Stalin did to the Russian people. In barely 100 pages, if you read Animal Farm, you understand how authoritarianism works, the tools that it uses. Whereas to find out about that through nonfiction, you'd have to read 2,000 pages on Russian history, which most of us aren't willing to do. Histories stay with us. So if we don't turn the Holocaust into stories, it remains history and likely will get forgotten. And that's why we tend to think of the Holocaust in black and white terms as something past, whereas war, for example, being endlessly turned into stories is very current. And we're not nervous about war. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, will be comfortable talking about some war they're familiar with. People get very nervous talking about the Holocaust. Maybe not here in India, because it's maybe such an alien tragedy to you, but in the West, in Canada, if you talk too much about the Holocaust, people are going to say, oh, are you Jewish? And if you're not Jewish, they're going to say, well, why are you talking so much about it? And so when Beatrice and Virgil came out, people exactly accused me of trivializing it. Jews are not animals. Well, I know they're not animals. This is called metaphor. And through metaphor, you understand better. Metaphor can make you see things in a different way that nonfiction cannot. And I'll give you a very good example. Humor. Humor and the Holocaust are a pair that does not go well together. It's very rare that people can use the Holocaust and discuss it in humorous terms and it being acceptable. You have to be a Jewish stand-up comic to be able to do that. And I'll give you one example of how humor can be very insightful. There's an American stand-up comic named Sarah Silverman, who was Jewish. So I'm repeating this joke of hers because she made it acceptable because she herself is Jewish. And her joke goes as follows, and it is offensive. And the joke goes along the lines of, I hate Nazis. They're fucking assholes. But they sure are cute babies. Now, what's interesting about that joke is it makes the link between adults and babies. That the Nazis were once little tiny innocent babies, and then something along the way made them into Nazis. So that joke suddenly makes you realize that Nazis, these horrible butchers, at one point were innocent children, and something happened. So sometimes humor in a very quick way gets you to insights that you don't necessarily get if you never have humor. So the usefulness of allowing the Holocaust and other things like partition, other tragedies, you don't want to trivialize them, but sometimes approaching it differently will squeeze out everything that can be squeezed out of it, all the wisdom. And so if we ban ourselves the use of metaphor and of stories, we impoverish what history can teach us. God, what a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. And, yesterday we did have Marcus here talking about Book Thief, book set in the Holocaust. But let's take a couple of quick questions. And if you could keep it short and a question rather than a comment, that would be helpful. So whoever has the mic, sir, go ahead.
Yann, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Hello. Yann, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Most authors are not very happy with the adaptation of their books into movies. What's your view about how Life of Pi was made into a movie?
I thought it was visually beautiful. I thought it was narratively a bit limp. A book to work as a movie must have a premise that works cinematically. And the mistake with Life of Pi is you think that because there's a boy in a lifeboat with a tiger, that it will necessarily, because it's visually compelling, that it'll make for a compelling cinematic story. And it doesn't. Movies work, if they're visually compelling, yes, but they must have relationship tensions. So Jane Austen is wonderful in the cinema because it's all about relationship. A boy and a tiger, if it's a real tiger, if it's not from Winnie the Pooh, if it's a real tiger, there is no relationship. There isn't a narrative relationship that works. So I think it was visually interesting, but I didn't find it that compelling. I wasn't drawn into it that much. Not in the way the book, I feel. In the book, you're seeing the perspective from Pi, so you are living with the tiger. And there's a lot more rumination allowed in a book than you could get in a movie. So, to be honest, I cried my way to the bank. So I don't regret the movie. It made me a lot of money. And it brought the story in some form to people who did not read the book. But as always, I think the book was better.
Sir.
Thank you so much. You concluded with the Holocaust. In your own experience of living in Canada, whether you have also engaged with the destruction of the life of First Nation people, who also embody a different modality of relationship between human, nature, and divine. And my second quick query is about magical thinking as the common thread between literature and religion. But what is the relationship between magical thinking and mystical thinking? Science is also a journey with the mystical, and therefore, science is not just reducing to making us live well. Science is also an equal contribution to making us a different kind of human being.
Thank you. First question, absolutely. I live in Saskatchewan, which has a high percentage of Indigenous people, of First Nations, as we sometimes call them. And you're absolutely right. We have dealt with them very poorly, and we need to understand their perspective on things and engage with the tragedy of colonialism and the First Nations. So absolutely. I mentioned the Holocaust, the partition, the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada is equally scandalous, and we have to try to resolve that and approach it in many, many ways. Now, recently in Canada, there's been a renaissance, for example, of Indigenous literature. And a lot of scandals attending the treatment of Indigenous people, Indigenous literature. There's a wonderful Canadian writer named Joseph Boyden. I don't know if you've heard of him. Joseph Boyden is a fantastic writer. Unfortunately, he made the claim that he was Indigenous, and a lot of his books are masterpieces, deal with Indigenous history in Canada, but unfortunately for him, he was caught out. It came to light that he's very likely not Indigenous. He claimed to be Indigenous. He spoke for Indigenous people, but he was not Indigenous. And that became a real scandal in Canadian literature and Can Lit. So now there's a much greater awareness of the plight of Indigenous people, and there's a real renaissance of their stories and storytelling, and them taking control of their own narrative. So that's wonderful. As for your second comment, I don't know what to say. I don't really see a link between the divine and medicine. I know in India there is with Ayurvedic medicine. It's not a tradition that you find in Canada. So to be honest, I don't have any comment. I take note of what you said. I respect your point of view. I don't have any particular response to it.
We have time for a couple more questions, so maybe something more towards the back. Person, and there's someone over there. She can.
Hello. Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to ask you, you were talking about how you dealt with the experience of animals as a kind of metaphor for the Holocaust. We were just discussing about another one graphic novel which has done this quite beautifully. Exactly, Mouse. So how would you respond to such a work which has basically made the characters into mice, and the author, if I'm not mistaken, was a part of the entire experience, and I'm not exactly sure. But how would you respond to such a work?
See, Mouse is very interesting. Mouse is, as the gentleman said, Mouse is a graphic novel in 2 volumes about the Holocaust. However, once again, it's not a fiction. It's Art Spiegelman's. It's the story of Art Spiegelman's father. And the reason it was so popular, and it was immensely popular, they created a special Pulitzer Prize just for Art Spiegelman. They, out of nowhere, created a Pulitzer for this graphic novel because it was so surprising. However, if you look at it more carefully, it is once again thinly disguised biography, in this case the biography of Art Spiegelman's father. And in some ways, and I met Art Spiegelman, I said to him, in some ways what you've done is quite, it's surprising that it was accepted because, once again, he was Jewish, so it gave it a veneer of acceptability. But as you said, in the novel, different animals portray different characters. So the Jews are mice, the Nazis are cats, the Americans are dogs, the Poles are pigs. Now, each one of those is kind of objectionable. The Swedes are reindeer. Like the Jews, well, they're not mice. They're a lot more resistant and aggressive, and if they need to, than mice. And Poles, to characterize them as pigs, yes, many Poles participated in the extermination of the Jews, but not all. So this simplification, this reduction of them into a very simplified animal personality, in many ways is objectionable. However, the brilliance of Mouse is that it did make Americans revisit the Holocaust yet again, in the same with the same tropes, but nonetheless he used a slightly different language that suddenly got a huge amount of attention, and that's good. Any kind of thinking about the Holocaust. See, the problem with the Holocaust is we never think about it. You think it, like in Canada, once a year there's a Holocaust Day, people briefly think about it, they haul out this aging Holocaust survivor who always says the same message of never again, which doesn't really work, because obviously it's not going to happen in literal ways. It's too long to answer. Anyway, you got to renew the message, and you got to renew the way it's delivered, and you need to renew the language. So Mouse did it in an interesting way. That kind of approach needs to be pursued, I think.
I think there was a lady in the back with the last question. If you could, yeah, right back there.
Hello, I've come from Bombay, and my daughter was very excited that I'm sitting and listening to you. It's a question from her, that can you ask him whether the story of Life of Pi was actually animals, or were the animals actually analogies for people? Was the tiger real or imagined?
When I started touring for Life of Pi, I had 2 questions that kept on coming every single time. Which story is true, and then what's the meaning of the island? Those questions kept on coming up. It's not for me to decide. It's for your daughter to decide which story she wants to believe. People have this idea that the author has the right answer. I don't. Books, and especially Life of Pi, is an open book. It's a democratic novel. It's an election. Read Life of Pi and you have one of two votes. You can vote for the animals, the story with animals, or the story without. It's entirely your right as a citizen of the arts to read it the way you want. So it's up to your daughter to decide. Generally, people who are predisposed to being very rational will choose the story without animals. And people who are slightly more capable of making leaps of faith will choose the story with animals. So your daughter has to decide which one she is.
We could put him on the spot and say which one does he choose, but I don't want to do that because I think some things should remain an open book. With that, it's his first time in Kolkata, so please join me in thanking Yann Martel for here.
Thank you very much, Sandip. Thank you very much to you.